Welcome to the Curiosity Dude podcast. In today's episode, we're diving into the fascinating topic of migrations of ancient people. Where and why did our ancestors go? Globe showing Europe, Africa. We'll explore the reasons behind these epic journeys, the challenges our ancestors faced, and how their movements shaped the world we live in today. From the first steps out of Africa to the spread across continents, join us as we unravel the mysteries of ancient human migrations. If you enjoy our content, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring more curious content to you. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's get curious together. Today, we will talk about the migration of ancient humans, how they wandered around, and what resulted from it. The first question that always comes up is, why did they move in the first place? The answer is quite simple. They moved because they could, and because there was food available nearby. The main goal was to find resources as usual. The movement of ancient humans, much like modern humans, was essentially a random walk, similar to the movement of any living creatures. If there is a certain number of people, bacteria, fungi, or any other living beings in a given area, and there are resources available, they will eventually consume those resources. If there are similar resources nearby and no one else is there, they will move to that area. Since they moved mostly on foot and were in no hurry, they probably covered about 20 kilometers a day, but usually much less. As hunter-gatherers, they could cover longer distances, but not in a single day, maybe over a couple of days. They moved slowly and not in a straight line, but rather in a random manner. With each move, their lives didn't change much, but things got better because they had already consumed all the resources in one place and found new resources in another. So, they moved a bit further each time, and after about 100,000 years, they found themselves on the other side of the continent or even on a different continent altogether. So, this movement was generally random, driven by the gradient of population density, from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Interestingly, these migrations were very slow, and humans were not the fastest movers. If we look at the synchronous migrations of animals at the same time and in the same approximate places, many animals, even those not particularly fast, migrated much more actively than humans. Humans sometimes moved the slowest. Animals like ostriches, pigs, zebras, antelopes, and others moved much more energetically. So, in this sense, humans were not record holders. However, humans excelled in consuming all available resources. Perhaps this is why humans didn't move much for a long time, because they could eat almost anything. By staying in one place, they would consume different types of resources until there was nothing left. For example, a zebra eats grass and once it's gone, it can't eat anything else and moves to the next patch of grass. But a human would eat antelopes, the same zebras, all the fish, then the grass, fruits, and everything else. So, one human could stay in one place for a longer time and have less need to move. Eventually, they would consume everything, including crayfish and bird eggs, and then move to the neighboring area. Another point is that although these movements were slow from our current perspective, they sometimes seem almost instantaneous. Our dating methods are just not that great. I mean, when we have an error margin of plus or minus, say 100,000 years for ancient times, like the era of some sharp stone tools, we just don't notice the migration. Over 100,000 years, or even plus or minus 5,000 years, we miss a lot. In 5,000 years, even if you walk 10 kilometers a day, that's 50,000 kilometers. You could walk around the Earth twice. So, when we look at this, it sometimes seems like people teleported. One moment they're here, the next dating shows them on the other side of the continent. But it's not because they teleported, it's because our dating methods aren't perfect, and we don't have that many sites. If we had all the sequential places they went, we'd see they walked like this, and like that, and like that. Plus, We should remember these migrations weren't just one group of travelers but entire populations. People often forget this when they think about why humans left Africa. People stayed in Africa and still live there today. It's not like they left Africa and then came back to repopulate it. They filled Africa, and as they multiplied, new people left Africa too. This applies to any territory, not just Africa. So, it wasn't one group of people walking from Africa to Australia or America. These were different people born in different centuries, with little in common. So, how did they move around? Well, it was pretty simple. Mostly they just walked everywhere. No fancy transportation, just good old-fashioned walking. That's why most migrations followed the same ecological zones and open plains that were our species' original habitats. You know, like when we climbed down from the trees and started living in the savanna. Wherever there was savanna, that's where we spread out. Early on, we weren't very adaptable and could only live in certain climates, so we stuck to those areas, like the southern edge of Eurasia. But as people became more diverse and biologically adapted to different environments and culture developed, they started moving north too. And let's not forget, if we're talking about ancient times, geography wasn't the same as it is now. Coastlines changed, land masses appeared and disappeared because sea levels fluctuated. These changes could happen pretty quickly, sometimes within a couple of generations. Imagine your great-grandparents walking on dry land, and by your time, it's all underwater. So, when people ended up in cold places, it didn't always mean they settled there because it was cold. They might have settled in a warm place that later turned cold because the climate changed. But sometimes they did settle in cold places too. Walking was the most basic way to get around, but eventually, people started inventing things. We have very few pieces of evidence about how they did this, but there are some hints. For example, there's a rock painting showing women carrying stuff on their backs. We know from ethnography that there are many ways to carry things: kids, baskets, food, on your back, chest, or under your arm. There's also a pathological case from Sungur, where a girl, or boy, according to geneticists, had significant wear on her neck vertebrae and collarbone, suggesting she carried heavy loads on her head, supported by her hand. This kind of wear and tear at such a young age indicates chronic pressure, which is unusual for children. So, this kid was probably carrying heavy stuff on her head, just like people in many parts of the world still do today. So, here's the only 100% reliable version of how it all went down. No doubt they also used some manual sleds or carts, but we have no traces of those. By the end of the Upper Paleolithic, dog sleds probably appeared. We found a bone artifact on Mount Ofontova that seems to be part of a dog sled. Similar elements are used in modern dog sleds. About 20,000 years ago, they might have used dogs for sledding. Reindeer sleds came much later, around the mid-Holocene. But mostly they just walked. Sometimes they swam, but we have no idea how they did it. Even monkeys swim to islands, and they still do it in Indonesia. Sulawesi, which was never connected to the mainland, has several endemic species. So they must have swum there. And let's not forget about the monkeys. Humans, from Homo erectus to Neanderthals and modern humans, crossed sea straits. We see evidence of them on one shore and then suddenly on the other. They probably made some kind of boats. If they had a kilogram of brain, they could figure out how to hollow out a log and float on it. They had tools, hands, and functioning brains. If they hunted mammoths, they could definitely make a boat. Finding such a boat is nearly impossible, but they definitely swam across, sometimes in groups. They settled as families, not just individuals. Migration started long before humans, with ancient primates and their relatives. At the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the Adipociriculae were quite the travelers. Adipociriculae are a mysterious group that might not even be related to primates, but they share many features with primate ancestors. There's a hypothesis that they are indeed primate ancestors, but they are poorly studied. Despite finding quite a few specimens, there are only a few species and genera, and they haven't been extensively researched. Only a handful of articles exist, with just a few people studying them. However, from a paleogeographic perspective, they are fascinating. The oldest Adipocirriculae are known from India, with later ones found in Europe and North Africa. This is particularly interesting because, at the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, India was an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, separated from Africa and Eurasia. Europe was also separated from Asia, and what is now South Asia and the Middle East were archipelagos. Africa was well separated from Europe, and Europe from Asia and America. Despite this, Adipocirriculae managed to live in India, which raises the question of how their ancestors got there. Later, they somehow ended up in Belgium, which was also an archipelago, and then in North Africa, which was not exactly close by. But it wasn't just Adipocirriculae making these journeys. In the same faunus of India from the late Cretaceous, there were also snakes and other animals related to both African and Asian species. Faunal exchanges happened in ways we don't fully understand, as there were no large archipelagos between these regions. The connection between Asia and India is also a bit of a mystery, as India eventually collided with Asia, raising the Himalayas. We know this from oceanic deposits found in the Himalayas. There might have been other islands we don't know about because they were crushed, submerged, or otherwise lost to time. So, whether it happened or not, who knows? But anyway, Europe isn't exactly around the corner. Even if they somehow made it from India to Asia, which, by the way, they didn't, getting to Europe was a whole other adventure. Interestingly, they seem to be older in Europe than in Africa. You'd think it would make more sense for them to go from India to Africa and then to Europe, but nope, they took the scenic route. Adipocirriculids are a poorly studied group, so there's still a lot to discover. In Asia, the fauna is well studied, but no sign of these guys. And they're not in North America either, even though European and North American faunas are very similar. It's like they just skipped North America entirely. This shows that even ancient, seemingly tree-bound animals could migrate across continents. So, it's no surprise that humans did even more impressive migrations later on. These critters were probably similar to modern tree shrews, but with a bit of a possum mixed in. By the middle of the Eocene, lemurs and early monkeys were happily migrating all over the place, independently of each other. The Eocene was a climatic optimum, with lush tropical forests everywhere, making it a paradise for primates. These early primates spread out almost everywhere, except for Australia and Antarctica. They were living the good life in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So, in Africa, things were a bit different. Not too many deposits there, but still, they moved around quite energetically. Deep within these half-monkeys, right in the middle of the ocean, normal monkeys appear. These aren't half-monkeys anymore, they're full-on monkeys. And there's a whole mystery with their movements. Let's start with lemurs. As I mentioned, the original half-monkey group is mostly North American. That's where most discoveries are made. But nowadays, lemurs mainly live in Madagascar. Madagascar has been an island since the end of the Jurassic, beginning of the Cute period, Cretaceous. Between it and Africa lies the Mozambique Strait, which hasn't changed much over time. It just quickly drifted away. Unlike India, which kept moving north all this time, Madagascar was pretty much nailed down. Not too far but not too close either, just enough distance to make getting there really tough because the currents here are super strong from north to south. If you start off from Africa, you'll probably get swept way down south. That's why Madagascar's flora and fauna are freakishly unique. The flora is less so since seeds can fly on the wind or get carried by water more or less okay. But fauna? Endemic with terrifying intensity. Insects, birds, you name it, and primates for sure. And lemurs? Definitely not swimmers. They hate water like cats hate vacuum cleaners. They only go near it for a drink. Nevertheless, how did they end up in Madagascar? Most likely from somewhere out of Africa? Or maybe Oman, because the closest fossil relative to modern Malagasy lemurs was actually found in Oman, which was part of Africa back when this whole Middle East thing was still African territory before the Red Sea even existed. Maybe similar species lived further south during what we now call Mozambique times and somehow crossed over. Or maybe they actually started off on some coastlines and got carried by currents straight to Madagascar? Who knows? It's hard to guess now. Ideally, we do some research on similar layers in Mozambique, if any geological ones exist at all. I'm sure there are, but no one has studied them yet. So, it seems like Mozambican paleontology doesn't really exist as a field. But it would be cool if it did. In Africa, with such ancient history, there's still some stuff up north, but down south, practically nothing has been found. But they did manage to get there, and this actually saved the lemurs to a large extent. Later on, the average half-monkey went extinct almost everywhere, surviving only in Southeast Asia, a bit on the mainland, and in Africa. In Europe, North America, and most of Asia, they disappeared because new predators and cool new competitors, like actual monkeys, showed up. Madagascar, however, was never settled by monkeys, except for humans who arrived in the Middle Ages, or maybe the Bronze Age at the latest. And, funnily enough, humans ended up wiping out most of the lemurs, but some still bring joy to everyone today. This was the first major oceanic migration of primates that we know of. There's also a big mystery with the first monkeys because the oldest known monkeys come from two opposite places. On one side, there's Southeast Asia, China, Thailand, Burma, where they found simians, like the lower jaw of a simian in Thailand and China. Not just them, but some 45,000-year-old teeth of anthrosimians in India, though not much is known about them. In later times, Asia had plenty of them, pandongs, phipotecs, and a whole bunch of others. On the other hand, similar creatures lived in North Africa, Egypt, and what is now Libya. And speaking of fauna, North Africa and South Asia are still quite similar today, but they were even more alike in the recent past, until humans came along and messed everything up. Back then, they really shouldn't have been so similar because, as you can see on the map, there was this pretty hefty sea called Paratethys between Africa and Northern Asia. Crossing it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The regions of today's Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India were like some kind of archipelagos where probably lots of mysterious shenanigans went down. But we don't know much about them because no one bothered to dig up those sediments. Basically, nobody ever really looked for anything in places like Afghanistan or Iran, the mighty Iran. There's probably stuff buried there waiting to be discovered. Plus, there are these mysterious combinations of ancientness and primitiveness. The oldest Asian species are found here while the most primitive ones pop up in North Africa. Ancientness and primitiveness aren't strict synonyms because sometimes we find bits from the past that suggest migration might have occurred from primitive states. We just haven't found the original source yet. But since our locations are limited, like eeny meeny miny mo, between North Africa and Southern Asia, we're left guessing what could have happened. It's possible that new variations of these monkeys actually arose somewhere in between because there's this theory that cool new groups emerge in odd places like islands due to isolation, since isolation breeds all sorts of wild stuff which might evolve into something bigger, or most likely go extinct because these unique faunas can't compete, but sometimes over millions of years evolution works its magic creating new groups. On the other hand, it's quite possible that the wildest evolution happened somewhere in Central Africa. From there, they spread north across Africa and into Southeast Asia. But, of course, we have no data on Central Africa. A curious piece of evidence for this possibility is the discovery of parapithecid teeth, those ancient monkeys, in South America, in Peru, on the opposite side of South America. No one expected to find parapithecids there, but they did. So, from Southeast Asia, they somehow managed to get there. They couldn't have, but they did. And North Africa is also a mystery. But from Central and Western Africa, they probably could have. So, in fact, they couldn't have, but they did. This means they lived somewhere in both Western and Central Africa for sure. But again, we have no data. In Western Africa, our paleontology is practically zero. There's nothing. Yet, there are tons of species there now, including some really cool ones, but we know nothing about them. So, there was some unknown hotspot there. The fact that the range is split into two parts is a paleontological fact. And somehow, they still moved around because the groups are scattered. Meanwhile, some groups remained endemic. For example, there are Afrotarsius, found only in North Africa. No one found them in Asia. So, there are literally just two species, and they stayed only in North Africa and didn't make it to Asia. Well, Simes, early on, they were only in Asia, not in Africa. But some parapithecids were in both places, and those amphipithecids were also in both places. So, it's still a mystery how all this happened, but the Eurodudes were evolving. Later, in the Oligocene, the climate started getting worse. India finally crashed into Asia, messing up all the currents. Africa started slowly sticking to Eurasia, but the sea there became shallow. Future Mediterranean vibes were setting in, and Eurasia was coming together, but South America was still doing its own thing. And right around this time, at the border of the Eocene and Oligocene, monkeys arrived in South America. Apparently, they got there at least twice, maybe even 4 times. I already mentioned the parapithecids. There's a new find of them in South America. And the ancestors of flat-nosed monkeys also arrived there 3 times independently. There are some primates that are kinda flat-nosed and kinda not so flat-nosed in South America, but their worn-out, isolated teeth make them super mysterious right now with new exciting finds. So, around 26 million years ago, we start seeing full-fledged remains of what are definitely the ancestors of modern broad-nosed monkeys. Whether it was the second, third, or maybe even the 4th wave of settlers, who knows? But these guys were definitely more modern. Anyway, whatever wave it was, their ancestors were chilling in North Africa, like some kind of ancient Egyptian monkeys. At that time, there were no potential ancestors in North America, but their descendants ended up in South America. Now, getting from the old world to the new one was tricky. There were all sorts of wild theories, including one about traveling through Antarctica, which sounds pretty crazy for monkeys. But theoretically, it was possible during the Eocene epoch because the climate was such that tropical forests grew in Antarctica. There were all sorts of fauna there, although no one's found any actual evidence yet. I personally think they never made it there, but if they had, they would have been just fine. Marsupials and birds were there, and forests were growing. The real problem was figuring out how to get from Africa to Antarctica because the currents run horizontally, not vertically. And there was definitely a connection between South America and Australia through Antarctica. Marsupials made the trip, and there were lots of other creatures too. So, theoretically, you could travel from Africa through Europe or the Bering Strait into North America and then down to South America. Migrations happened all over the place, judging by various animals. There were migrations through the Atlantic, across archipelagos, and through the Bering Strait. At least, that's what it looks like from the variety of species in North America and Eurasia. Eurasia was very similar, with ancestors of horses and all sorts of other animals evolving and migrating around that time. The problem is that by this point in North America, primates had vanished. Like poof, gone. And just where they disappeared was right there at that time. I mean, maybe there were a couple of species hanging on by a thread, some oddball Amy's rodents or some obscure lemur, but by the time Oligocene rolled around, they were pretty much history. At the end of the Eocene or somewhere around that border zone, they were Genizo. And these Amy's guys were so specialized that they clearly couldn't have been ancestors to our snub-nosed friends. No way, Jose. Their leg bones had fused together like some kind of biological superglue and wouldn't unfuse if you begged them to. Plus, their dental system was so simplified it's like they were on a permanent liquid diet. So crossing through North America? Not an option, no monkeys to be found there. It's like they all got an invite to some exclusive party elsewhere. The local fauna has been studied 6 ways from Sunday. Researchers have done their homework, but nope, not a single monkey passed through. That leaves us with one wild card, hopping straight from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, which back then was half its current size and had currents zipping along twice as fast thanks to straits between the Americas funneling them like water slides at an amusement park. In theory, you could have floated over on a log, especially since I mentioned earlier that it was getting cooler and drier, but everything's relative. Cooler and drier compared to what came before, but compared to today? It was practically sauna weather back then with temperatures up 6 to 10 degrees warmer than now planet-wide. Africa was decked out in tropical forests, the kind where you find Egyptian Phaeum fossils where now there's just sand for days. And speaking of Phaeum, it used to be mangrove central along lagoon shores teeming with life where now you'd only find Sahara sands for company. So if Sahara looked like that back then, Central West Africa must have been a party. The Congo Basin was a beast, with forests and giant trees everywhere. For small primates like our Egyptian monkey friends, one tree could be home for weeks or even months. If a tree fell into a river and floated out to sea, those monkeys wouldn't have to panic. As long as they had leaves, fruits, and bugs to munch on, and if they got lucky with some rain filling up a hollow for fresh water, they could theoretically float to America in a couple of weeks. The odds? Tiny, but hey, it only had to happen once or twice. Once upon a time, a couple of monkeys made it across, and then another group did too, but not in sync, obviously. They weren't paddling on the same log, but hey, the odds weren't zero. After all, it wasn't just monkeys making these epic migrations, lots of creatures did it. Even reptiles who couldn't care less, just chilling in a hollow tree for weeks or months. Spiders too, though they're not exactly energetic. And let's not forget the hoatzins, which are basically chickens with flight issues. They couldn't fly across the Atlantic, but their fossil ancestors were in Africa, and now their descendants are in the Amazon. So, if these birds, which need more food than monkeys, could float across on a log, then monkeys definitely could. Over millions of years, with millions of trees floating out to sea, the chance of one log with live monkeys making it wasn't zero. And that's how they got there. Oh, and rodents too, around the same time. Ancestors of modern guinea pigs, capybaras, degus, and chinchillas also came from Africa. Their closest relatives are in Southeast Asia and Africa, but they ended up in America. Crossing the ocean from Asia would have been too much, so they must have floated over from Africa. Rodents can't go without food or water either, but they made it because the climate and currents were different back then. It was a massive migration, especially surprising since humans took so long to get to America. Humans, unlike monkeys, are big. A family of 10 monkeys can survive on a big log for a month, munching on leaves and whatever else is on the tree. But 20 humans on a log? No way. Although there are stories of boats crossing the ocean with a few people, usually swept away by storms or on purpose. But it was harder for humans. Anyway, that's ancient history. More recently, early Australopithecines from Africa migrated too. They were found in East Africa, mainly in Ethiopia and Chad, but who knows where else they roamed. Or take somewhere even further, like Mali, Burkina Faso, or the Ivory Coast. There just haven't been any studies there. I'm sure they lived much more widely in Central Africa, mainly because monkeys live there just fine now. They were probably in South Africa too, but there are no deposits or researchers looking into it. At least, they were somewhere around there. And as I mentioned earlier, they didn't really migrate much. They evolved, sure, but they didn't move around a lot because they're forest animals. If you look at the modern forest fauna of Africa, you'll see that most species have very small ranges. Take a map of African monkey ranges, for example. You'd think Central Africa is one big forest, right? Well, now it's pretty chopped up, but it used to be one big forest. So why don't these monkeys live from the Guinea coast all the way to Tanzania? Nope, they inhabit specific forests. On this mountain, with its unique microconditions and plants, lives one type of monkey. But on the next mountain over, that monkey doesn't live there because there's a 10-meter wide stream in between. And the monkey can't cross it because, well, it just doesn't care to. If the branches don't touch, it's not jumping from tree to tree, and that's that. No chance for the monkey to cross. Or if we talk about larger creatures like modern-day chimpanzees, they live on the north bank of the Congo River and only on the south bank of the Ubangi River. They haven't interacted for a couple of million years. The Congo River is an insurmountable barrier for chimpanzees, even though you might think they could just walk around it. After all, it starts somewhere, right? But no, it's impassable and they don't need to cross it. As I mentioned earlier, resources in the forest are more than enough for monkeys in a very small area. If there's a patch of forest with fruit trees on this mountain, that's enough for the monkeys for their entire lives. They spend 2 weeks on this tree, 2 weeks on that one, and 2 weeks on another. By the time a month is up, the fruits on the first tree are ripe again, and they can just go in circles without any problems. This results in these small, localized species. This applies not only to monkeys but also to antelopes. If you look at the range of forest antelopes, like tragelaphs, there aren't many species, but there are plenty of subspecies. These subspecies are scattered in small patches here and there, and they don't migrate far. Forest creatures don't like or want to move far. The same likely applied to early Australopithecines. These early hominids were forest creatures that started venturing into the savanna. This was the most interesting time when they began to venture out slowly but hadn't fully left the forest. They were just starting to develop their ability to move around, running to the next bush or tree and climbing back up. They had to do it gradually. Moreover, we have legs and arms, and from Sahelanthropus to Ardipithecus, we see that arboreal adaptations dominated over terrestrial ones, but terrestrial adaptations were slowly emerging. This inability to move quickly and far is actually quite remarkable because it gives hope of finding many new species. Currently, there aren't many known early Australopithecines: Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, 2 species of Ardipithecus, and the Anamensis australopithecus. So, let's say 5 species. But that's a very small number of locations, and there's no doubt that as soon as they start looking more, they'll find another 10 to 20 species without any problems. At least, in slightly earlier times, around 15 million years ago, on just one island, Ruzinga, there were about 10 species of humans in different layers. There were good deposits there, covered by volcanic ash, and if there were 10 species in one spot, why wouldn't there be more Australopithecines? However, the climate was getting worse, and savannas were gradually taking over. This was a time when more than 6 human-like species went extinct. So, 15 million years ago, on one Ruzinga, there were 10 to 15 species, depending on how you count. But now, in this location, there's only one monkey species, and here, 2 primate species, colobus monkeys and these very ardipithecines, and that's it. But judging by the fact that these colobus monkeys made up a third of the entire fauna, life for primates wasn't so bad. Colobus monkeys are also arboreal creatures, rarely coming down to the ground. If they make up 30% of the fauna, another 30% are forest antelopes, and the remaining third includes ardipithecines. So, things weren't so bad, and they just sat in these little forests. But the forests were shrinking, and they had to move a little bit. They developed these abilities more during the time of the gracile australopithecines. Again, there are some questions about whether we are observing this or if it was actually the case because, at this time, the range visibly expanded compared to previous times. Maybe it wasn't that the range expanded, but our knowledge expanded because these gracile australopithecines were found in both East Africa and a bit in the north. But honestly, there's only one point there, not a whole strip, and they are also found in South Africa. But personally, I have no doubt that they lived in North Africa because the Sahara wasn't a desert yet, and they could have lived in West Africa too. Why wouldn't they? Some modern species live there, so why wouldn't australopithecines exist there too? There are no finds in some intervals, but it's clear that they moved around somehow. Nevertheless, it's noteworthy that these gracile australopithecines were also quite endemic. The main species is the Afar australopithecus, but there are others like Burrell ghazali, Africanus, and various others. There are many species, and they differ from each other in small, not very significant details, which allow us to judge whether this is an ancestor or not. But in the intervals, some intermediate variants seem to be visible. For example, classic Afar australopithecines are found in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Slightly later, but still seemingly Afar australopithecines from South Kenya, they are somewhat similar to South African Africanus. Therefore, there is an opinion that the distribution of traits was not strictly by species, but rather a gradual, clinal distribution. So, the northern ones were different from the southern ones, and in between, there were some average ones, slowly changing. Nowadays, among African animals, such lines of variability are well known. Take baboons, for example. Here, the baboons are yellow, they're white, and in between, you get some mixed colors. Over here, they have thick manes, over there, not so much, and in between, you get some medium manes. There's a theory that maybe they interbreed, but another theory suggests that it's not that they formed separately and then started interbreeding, but rather that this gradation has always existed. Now, these ranges are breaking up because humans have settled everywhere, pushing these animals out, and they live in fragmented pieces. But for Australopithecus, no one was pushing them out. Moreover, the savannas were forming in a way similar to their current state, and Australopithecus could walk on two legs and get at least half of their food from the savanna. So, they slowly moved around, but there was still some endemism. Interestingly, no one has found Australopithecus outside Africa during this time, which was between 4 to 3 or 2.5 million years ago. Meanwhile, other African and Asian animals were happily running back and forth, like pigs, ostriches, baboons, leopards, buffaloes, elephants, rhinos, beavers, and many others. Even hippos, which are usually tied to swamps, were moving around. It's still unclear where hippos originated, but they lived from Africa to Java. Nowadays, they're strictly African, but they used to live all over South Asia, including Indonesia. There were different species, but some were not very different from each other. So, if even such seemingly non-migratory creatures like hippos, with their clumsy proportions, could move far, then it seems like Australopithecus was destined to do so too. Nope, they pretty much stayed in the same place. But again, it's possible we just haven't discovered everything yet. Personally, I'm more than sure that once they start properly exploring the fauna in places like Arabia, Kamaraqa, Iran, and further into Waganistan, they'll find Australopithecus remains there. But that's just a hypothesis, not really based on anything solid. There are a couple of bone fragments from Pakistan that, based on dating and morphology, could potentially be Australopithecus. There's one article about them, but the fragments are so vague. Honestly, there's even some doubt whether they're primates at all. So, how many Australopithecus were there? Well, some, but probably primates. But there's almost nothing left of their teeth, just roots, a piece of jaw, and some kneecap, which I don't remember what it's about. There could have been other monkeys too. There were successful later Australopithecus, for example. So, no one has found Australopithecus outside Africa yet, and by default, they don't exist outside Africa. Maybe they did, but in any case, other animals are known from the same time in places like India, where the fauna has been well studied. We know about the connections of other animals from that time, like pigs, which had several migrations to and from Africa. Pigs are much more adaptable to closed habitats like bushes and forests, unlike Australopithecus. It's surprising, but they spread out across Africa. Their limited mobility was likely because they didn't live in open savannas. Sometimes they're depicted as wandering in endless grasslands, but in reality, such savannas didn't really exist back then. They got half their food from forests, so they lived in bushy areas, not open plains. These areas had small, crooked trees, not giant ones. For a creature about 1.5 meters tall, these trees weren't enough to climb and eat fruits. But they could still find food in these bushy areas with fruit trees and roots. So, they didn't need to migrate far. They slowly spread out and lived in Africa, at least 100% for sure. Back in the early days of Homo, our ancestors like Homo habilis, and even earlier, the Rudolfensis gang, were the first to spread out according to anthropology. Although, to be honest, their range didn't change much from Africa. It's the same story with Prinsfeldovsu, whoever that is, and even more so, we don't have any anthropological finds of these early Homo in North Africa. But guess what? We do have them in Georgia, which is nice. If we look at archaeology, the range is much wider. So, this is more of an anthropological tale, but archaeology shows us finds from North Africa, especially the Northwest, and from the Sahel zone and the Sahara too. Not too long ago, a couple of years back, they found a site in Erden dating back 2.4 million years. So, this was right on the route they must have taken to get to Georgia. Clearly, people had already spread across Africa, except maybe the central part where the chimpanzees were chilling in the forest. Plus, the entire Middle East up to Georgia was inhabited. And not just the Caucasus, but even further north to Daman and the area around the Don River, where there are also archaeological finds. But in Crimea, there's no archaeology or anthropology of such ancient times yet. So, it seems Crimea and the northern Black Sea coast weren't settled at that time, at least not until 2 million years ago, maybe a bit later. So, these Homo habilis and the earlier Rudolfensis folks, the Georgians, who were basically the same Rudolfensis, were slowly spreading out. Interestingly, in terms of their ecological abilities, they weren't much different from Australopithecus. Same body proportions, short legs, broad shoulders, basically the same Australopithecus, but now with brains and tools, and they started eating a lot more meat. Sometimes it's said that technological progress and a new diet allowed humans to leave Africa. This is written everywhere, even in textbooks and school materials. Well, personally, I have serious doubts about this. I mean, look at ostriches. The lack of technological progress never stopped them from spreading all the way to South America, where they still live, and in Australia, Africa, and all over Asia, even up to Mongolia and China. They were everywhere. So, ostriches managed to spread without any technological progress. They even made it to Australia way before humans did. Somehow, they did it even though they couldn't fly. No one really knows how, but they did. And what about those giant tortoises on the Galapagos Islands? They somehow ended up there and on the Seychelles and even in Australia. They lived everywhere until humans unfortunately wiped most of them out. But they managed to spread without any technological progress. So, It's strange to say that humans needed technological progress to spread. It seems like it wasn't about technological progress at all, but just how things happened. Sometimes, the ranges of animals are completely illogical. You might find a creature known from just 2 specimens caught in one spot, and no one has ever seen them anywhere else. Meanwhile, a very similar species lives all over the planet and is doing just fine. So, these ecological connections can be quite mysterious and not well understood. And it seems like it was the same back then. Plus, there's the factor of research luck. We have 5 skulls from Dmanisi, but if they hadn't started digging up that medieval castle, we might not have found anything at all. So, guess what? They just found another tooth, like literally just now. Not in Dmanisi, but still in Georgia, just a different spot. This tooth is as ancient as the ones in Dmanisi. Funny thing is, they might not have found Dmanisi at all if they hadn't been digging up a medieval castle. They stumbled upon some ancient fauna, started sorting through it, and bam! Found some human remains. In other places, it's all about the tools. In Daman, it's stone tools. In Rostov-on-Don, they didn't even find tools, just a camel bone with some scratches. Across North Africa in Erden, it's tools again. Without these tools, we wouldn't even know people were there. Australopithecines didn't have tools, so we don't see them. That's why I believe we'll find Australopithecines outside Africa eventually. Tools just preserve better. But hey, we found skulls and this new tooth, which is cool. It shows that human spread wasn't far. In places like India or Java, with such ancient history, no one's found anything yet. I searched for a long time, but it seems there were no habilis there. Their mobility skills were still pretty basic, even though the climate was favorable. In Georgia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region, and Crimea, the climate was like Africa's. There were giant hyenas, antelopes, elephants, rhinos, and all sorts of African animals. Even giant 4-meter ostriches. Crazy, right? But there were also some non-tropical animals like bears and wolves, which had a bit of a northern vibe. Still, they were tropical in a way. Honestly, from an ecological standpoint, nothing really stopped people from moving around. They just didn't feel the need to. But then things sped up, probably because people switched to a meat diet. Meat gets eaten faster than plants, which grow back quickly. You eat some fruit, and in 3 days, new ones are ready. No big deal. But meat? It takes longer to grow, and sometimes it even tries to run away. If you start chasing animals with a spear, they just vanish into the mist. It's like modern Africa where animals in reserves don't even care about people. They barely move for cars. But where hunting is allowed, you might not see a single animal for days. Even birds are scarce because animals know those 2-legged creatures want to eat them. So, people started migrating to follow the hoofed animals. At first, it was a weak trend, but then it picked up. Suddenly, humans spread over huge areas. It's like I said, our dating errors are bigger than the speed of migration. Homo erectus and earlier hominins spread from Indonesia to Britain. They started looking more modern, with long legs and short torsos, perfect for long-distance travel. This long-leggedness is a great adaptation. You can see it in animals too. Those in forests look different from those in the steppes. These early humans occupied the same ecological niches as before. No magical tech progress, just running around and the emergence of savannas. Up until this point, a lot of these areas were covered by dense tropical forests, which the savanna folks just couldn't get through. But then, savannization really took off, like, seriously far. If we're talking late stages here, that's like 400,000 years ago, we're already kicking off the beginning of the ice ages. Up north, things were getting chilly, and down south, proper open grassy plains were popping up. And on an open grassy plain, you can walk forever. Like, as far as the plain goes, you can go without a hitch. Nothing's stopping you from just physically relocating yourself. So then you've got roughly similar fauna popping up, the kind that migrates huge distances. And following this fauna, chasing after antelopes and zebras, you could run anywhere you fancy. It's telling that not only antelopes and zebras move around, but people too. Speaking of which, humans back then were still in Africa as ergasters, later evolving into erectus. And what's curious is that African, Asian, Chinese, and early European skulls don't differ much from each other. If we take a skull without any labels or notes saying from such and such cave, we'd never guess whether it's from Eritrea or Java Island. There's no method for it because they're practically identical. That's because human settlement happened so fast over hundreds of thousands of years that there wasn't time for any mega-specific traits to develop. From this point on, humans become this super widespread species settling across vast distances. Animals are either stenobionts or eurybionts. Stenobionts are those adapted to living in one specific place. Think modern pandas stuck in their bamboo forests, and then there are eurybionts who live wherever they want with total indifference, like modern wolves found everywhere from Africa to Europe to India to mountains to steppes, even deserts if there's some meat or even melons around. Humans became super eurybionts, but not quite super yet because, as I mentioned earlier, they were still only in tropical zones, not even venturing into subtropics yet. Actually, each one of them has its own fancy Latin name, something really clever, but these subspecies are distinguished quite arbitrarily. Right now, I'm on fire saying that we don't have solid morphological grounds for this. Honestly, if we have a skull and we don't know where it's from, we'd never guess if it's from Africa or Java. They really look alike. But time goes on. First, human abilities increase with movement, and second, morphology starts to change. The most striking example of such supermigration is the settlement of Flores by the ancestors of hobbits and the emergence of these very hobbits. The original Pithecanthropus, let's say the Sangiran ones living in Java, didn't need to sail since Java was part of the mainland back then. They arrived on foot through a chain of what are now islands but were then part of this Sundaland extension. They settled at its edge and then crossed 2 or 3 straits. Probably 3 considering how Sundaland's limbs reached Flores according to modern geographical reconstructions. These straits were about 20 to 30 kilometers wide, 26 at their narrowest point, a pretty decent distance actually. You could see land on a clear day somewhere on the horizon. Yes, birds fly there and all that jazz, a mountain peak sticking out, but still you can't quite reach those 20 kilometers just like that. Not to mention that this wasn't some diving record holder or anything, and yet an entire company had to make it so they could live there for hundreds of thousands more years to proliferate and reproduce, and yet they made it there 1,000,000 years ago. In Usage, there are tools from 1,000,000 years ago, and in Matamench there are parts, like lower jaws and teeth, dating back 850 to 650,000 years. In Liangbua, from 90 to 50,000 years ago, there's this skull that's 80,000 years old, which is kind of the final result. The settlement of Flores is remarkable for 2 reasons. First, they crossed sea straits 1,000,000 years ago, which is super cool. But on the flip side, they couldn't cross it again for the next 1,000,000 years, in either direction. These hobbits, the second remarkable point, had already transformed into a distinct species, showing no new influx of characters. So, they just sat there, not going anywhere. Such migrations were possible but extremely unlikely and very difficult. Not only was Flores settled at that time, but also Sulawesi, another island without a land bridge to the nearest mainland. There are pigs on Sulawesi, and elephants used to be there too. Elephants swim pretty well, but pigs, not so much. Different pigs made it there twice, and macaques too. The fauna is a mix of Asian and Australian, with plenty of land. So, fauna and people arrived on both sides. On Luzon in the northern Philippines, Part of the Philippines was connected to the mainland, but Luzon wasn't, so they had to swim there too. Some terrestrial animals made it, like deer, elephants, and pigs, and later, macaques and people. On Sulawesi, people are known only by their tools, while on Luzon, there are not so pretty fragments, but definitely people, and also a dwarf species. 1,000,000 years ago, people could cross sea straits, but very rarely. In the Mediterranean, there are traces of archaic human migrations to various islands, but those islands were closer. So here's the thing. On Crete, for example, they found these ancient tools that look pretty terrifying. But on the right side, the dating is all over the place, and it's unclear what they found on the surface of these tools. There are some unclassified monuments, but judging by the tools, they were probably made by some ancient humans. Now, how did they get there? Did they swim? It's a mystery. Maybe they had some kind of boats or rafts, but nobody knows for sure. There's even a hypothesis that the ancestors of these hobbits were carried to Flores by a tsunami. But come on, there are 3 straits to cross. What kind of mega tsunami was that supposed to be? It's a pretty weak theory. Imagine surfers riding logs on a tsunami, planning their trip to Lilliput. It's just too fantastic. Anyway, these ancient humans somehow made it. But the evidence shows that the chances of this happening were very slim. Still, people kept spreading out over the same territories. It's not like they were exploring new lands. They were just expanding within the same area. In the south, for example, they didn't need to swim. They could just walk. But what's interesting is the movement to the north. Around 500,000 to 130,000 years ago, the ice ages began, and the climate got much worse. Yet people stayed in the north. Life got harder, and if they were just animals, they would have had to adapt or migrate south, like many animals did. But humans moved north even though they hadn't developed any cold-resistant adaptations yet. Physically, they were still tropical creatures. They were in Africa, Europe, China, India, and Java, looking pretty similar everywhere. For example, they all had wide noses, regardless of the location. But they started to diversify a bit. If you took a skull, you might not be able to tell if it was from Africa or China, but there were some differences. That's why we have names like Rhodesiensis, Heidelbergensis, and so on. This northern expansion was likely due to technological progress. They started building more permanent shelters, which at least protected them from the wind if not the snow. And they began using fire regularly. Around 354,000 to 300,000 years ago, things started to heat up, literally. Our ancestors figured out how to keep themselves warm and got way more into hunting. Before, hunting was like, meh, let's catch something if we can, but now it was all about those epic group hunts for big, fancy herbivores. We're talking elephants, rhinos, deer, you name it. Suddenly, there were bones everywhere, and our protein intake skyrocketed. This also meant we could handle the cold much better. But let's not forget, most people lived in the south where it was warmer. Over time, populations started to spread out and evolve into unique forms. Take Normandy and India, for example. Skulls from these places don't look much different from African or European ones, but other bones, like clavicles, are tiny. This suggests we might be looking at some ancient pygmies. India, despite not being an island, was like an ecological island because of the Himalayas. Getting there was tough, and the climate was already modern-like. Deserts started forming between Western Asia and India, making it even more isolated. So, you get these unique pygmies and other quirky folks with strange skull features. In Asia, you had these Denisovans or their ancestors roaming around. By this time, they were spreading out quite a bit. African and European populations were also starting to show some differences. So, here's the deal. It's like an ecological migration happening here. They're moving into cold climate areas because the cold itself is shifting south, but people are heading north anyway. They're even moving to places with snow and some kind of winter, like modern southern Europe. Over time, during the lives of Neanderthals and their buddies like the Denisovans and other ancient folks, they settled these areas for 1,000,000 years but lived there until about 50,000 years ago. These guys didn't move far geographically, but ecologically, they were like, hey, we're still here, but everything's different. It's like they moved to another continent without actually moving. Neanderthals, for example, got all stocky and barrel-shaped, adapting to the cold climate of the Ice Age. The Ice Age wasn't just one big freeze but a series of cold snaps, so people were constantly migrating and displacing each other. This is especially clear at sites like Hawamation and Jebel Sandman in Arabia, where you can see layers of habitation from 400,000 to 50,000 years ago. It's rare to find such a continuous record from ancient humans to modern ones. So, you had different tool cultures coming and going, like the Acheulean complex, then another Acheulean complex, and then Levallois techniques, which were like the Swiss army knives of the prehistoric world. These techniques moved from Africa to Arabia and then to Europe, showing that people were constantly on the move, back and forth between continents. So, back in the day, like way back, say 200 to 300,000 years ago, on the walls of the Middle East, you had these proto-humans hanging around. They were kind of like early versions of us, but not quite there yet. Think of them as the beta version of humans. Fast forward to about 100,000 years ago, and they started looking more like us, but still not fully human. In places like Skol, you had these guys mixing it up with Neanderthals. It's like a prehistoric party where everyone's invited. Over in Kafsa, things were a bit different. The Neanderthals there didn't really mix with the proto-humans. It's like they were the cool kids who kept to themselves. Then, around 55 to 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals made a comeback. In Ahmed, they had some human-like features, probably because they mingled with the proto-humans. Meanwhile, in Shanidar, you had these super Neanderthals who had never even seen a human. It's like they were living in their own little bubble. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone, and the humans were back in action, spreading out all over the place. This back-and-forth migration happened a lot, not just in the Middle East but in other places too. For example, in the Altai region, there were at least 2 waves of Neanderthals, each with their own unique traits. And don't even get me started on the Denisovans running around before and after the Neanderthals. It was like a prehistoric game of musical chairs. So, in Israel, it's convenient that they have, well, in some places, immigration wasn't really a thing because they were pretty isolated. Like, in some remote areas, people just settled down and stayed put. But, fun fact, even Neanderthals sometimes managed to travel by sea. There are a few islands near Greece where they found Neanderthal tools. These islands, like Zakynthos and Lefkada, aren't connected to the mainland, but Neanderthals lived there. They must have occasionally hopped over, despite the 20-kilometer straits. It didn't stop them from paddling back and forth, though they weren't exactly keen sailors. Then came the Cro-Magnons, who were much more into traveling. Their migrations weren't just biological but also cultural. We can see this from the stuff they moved around like seashells. This is especially well studied in France, where archaeologists did a great job. They found shells far from the sea, showing that people carried them over long distances. For example, in Kostianki, near Voronezh, they found seashells, even though the nearest sea is quite far. The Black Sea was closer, but it wasn't very accessible during the Ice Age. They also found exotic shells and amber, which is rare in nature. Interestingly, amber was found in one place but not used there. Instead, it was crafted into items hundreds of kilometers away, where it was more valuable because it wasn't just lying around. So, tracking these items helps us understand ancient trade and migration. For instance, black flint from Grimaldi in northern Italy was found in France, 200 to 300 kilometers away. For a hunter, that's not a big deal. They could cover that distance in a week. But the real question is, would they be allowed to cross into another group's territory? By then, territories were pretty well defined, and stepping out of your hunting grounds could get you into trouble. So, there weren't that many of these finds, which shows it wasn't super common. It was probably a means of exchange and had some value. People already had a sense of value, thinking, hey, this is some cool stuff we don't have. You could live just fine without fancy stuff, but having a black flint arrowhead or a plate was pretty cool. Obsidian is a great example, especially in Melanesia. Volcanoes don't move around, so obsidian can be traced back to its source by its chemical properties. Even 30,000 years ago, people were moving obsidian over hundreds of kilometers, often by sea. They even transported live animals. On the Admiralty Islands, they found bandicoots and cuscus that shouldn't naturally be there. People probably brought them over, maybe as pets or for some other reason. By this time, people were making sea voyages of 400 kilometers or more. They had decent boats, but most of their trips were within sight of land. They didn't have the sophisticated boats with outriggers until much later, like in the Bronze Age. Southern Melanesia wasn't settled until much later, and places like Madagascar remained uninhabited for a long time. People moved around not just to find food but also to hang out and explore. They ended up settling almost the entire planet, running into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other mysterious folks along the way. So, I tried to compile some data not so much about migrations but about interbreeding. Modern geneticists are now reconstructing gene flows between different ancient species. Not long ago, these same geneticists were telling us fairy tales that there was no interbreeding at all. Then they started calculating unexpected percentages, but I didn't include those numbers because the methods vary a lot. It turns out that Homo sapiens mixed with Neanderthals several times, Neanderthals with Denisovans, Sapiens with Denisovans, and some unknown species with both Sapiens and Denisovans. And this happened quite a few times. But differentiation started happening, and these various populations emerged. The thing is, 50,000 years isn't enough time for new species like hobbits to appear. Hobbits took 200,000 years to evolve, and we only had 50,000. Nevertheless, sapiens broke out of Africa somewhere between 80,000 and 50,000 years ago. The exact numbers vary, but around 55,000 years ago is a good estimate. Then they spread to places that had never been inhabited before, like Australia, Tasmania, the Americas, Polynesia, and Madagascar. This was the triumph of migrations. Initially, all sapiens were tropical-looking, but as they spread, they started to differentiate, eventually forming modern races. One particularly interesting migration was from Sunda to Sahul. Most of Indonesia was connected to Sunda, while Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed Sahul. There were some hobbits hanging around on the way, but sapiens managed to cross the straits. There are two theories about how they did it, the northern route and the southern route. It's not that important which one they took, but they spread out. After reaching Sahul, no new people arrived for thousands of years. Even if there were new migrations, they were minimal. Someone did bring the dingo to Australia 4,000 years ago, which probably didn't swim there on its own. Someone also brought outrigger canoes and bows and arrows to northern Australia. By this time, the Torres Strait already existed, and even the small islands between New Guinea and Australia were almost insurmountable for sapiens. Before Europeans arrived, some Indonesians knew about Australia and went there to catch sea cucumbers, but they weren't in a hurry to settle. This shows that knowing about a land and having the technology to reach it doesn't guarantee mass migration. So, here's the deal. They knew there was a shore where you could sail in, catch some sea cucumbers, and even find those famous Macassar burials from Australia, way before Europeans, like before Columbus. But farming there? Nope, not happening. The Macassars were either fishing or farming, and some spear-wielding aborigines were around too. Catching sea cucumbers to sell to the Chinese? Sure, that's doable. But living there? No way. They were like, why bother? Our own islands are way nicer. For the Hiratka, it was fine, but still. So, having the ability and the need are two different things. America could have been settled in various ways. There was this wild hypothesis about African settlement from Africa, but it was super unlikely. People pointed to the so-called Negroid features of the Olmec stone heads, saying they looked similar. But those heads were actually a mix of a stern leader's face and jaguar features, which is undeniably cool. So, when you try to carve a 2-meter-wide stone face of your beloved leader to look like a jaguar, it somehow ends up looking like a black person. Technically, that's what happened. But there were no credible witnesses to such migration. There was also the Solutrean hypothesis from Europe. People said, look at the Solutrean points and Clovis points, they're almost the same. Plus, the oldest Clovis points are from America. But, first of all, that's typological, everything else is different. And secondly, during the Ice Age, the North Atlantic was just ice. How would they even move around? And between the latest Solutrean and the earliest Clovis, there's at least a 2,000-year gap. Where were they wandering for those 2,000 years in the ice-covered North Atlantic, where even seagulls couldn't migrate? So, it's extremely, extremely unlikely. There was even this bold hypothesis. What if there was a direct migration across the Pacific Ocean? Because let's face it, the skulls of modern Melanesians and the noggin of ancient Paleo-Indians from places like Lagoa Santa are eerily similar in many ways. We're talking broad noses, something for cranial features, you get the gist. But then you think about it, that would be some super direct migration. I mean, sure, Magellan did his thing, but that was totally in reverse. And let's not forget they offed him in the end. So here we have an almost too cool theory. If they started somewhere in Asia, or is it Melanesia? They'd have to cross the entire Pacific without leaving as much as a flip-flop behind. These guys would have to be super sailors or something. Then there's surviving coastal deserts like Peru on a no-rain for thousands of years diet, scaling mountains second only to Himalayas in height, and maybe even tougher, trekking through Amazonian jungles wilder than your craziest uncle, all to die out in Lagoa Santa without leaving any trace? They'd have to be super sailors, desert survivalists, rock climbers, jungle experts. It's hard to swallow. So perhaps the most plausible theory that checks out with everything is moving through Beringia because Asian anthropological features resemble those of American Indians. Cultures overlap quite a bit too. So yeah, probably happened just like that. And about Bering Strait migrations? Seems folks moved not so much with purpose but more like assorted groups who ended up together by chance, not matching on any parameters really. As far as we know now, there were at least 3 major migrations but actually lots of little bands doing their thing with 3 main components making up Native Americans. Proto-Mongoloids from China territory, Proto-Equatorials likely from further south, and some Proto-Uraloids from Siberia. Were they mixed along the way, in Siberia, Beringia, or already in America? Nobody knows for sure. We have very little data on Siberia and even less on early America. But judging by modern Native Americans, it was something like that. This is backed by anthropology, mythology, and even genetics. For example, DNA found in Malta and Fountain Grove is similar to that of North American inhabitants. Meet the culture buffs of Coves, the masterminds behind Coves culture. So, here's the deal. These genetic lines are pretty well rooted. Think of them as family trees with DNA. And guess what? Those Anzac folks have genetic variants similar to modern Far East inhabitants. We're talking Chinese, Japanese, and Native Americans, the contemporary kind. Meanwhile, over in eastern Siberia, They've got genes that are part European buffet and part Northwest Siberian smorgasbord with a sprinkle of Native American, up to 1/3 Native American by some accounts. It's like they all got together for a gene pool party. Now onto something truly epic, tracing these ancient migrations through mythology connections. Enter Yuri Bereskin. What a legend! This guy's an ethnographer archaeologist extraordinaire who spent his life collecting myths like they were going out of style, which they're not. You can find his treasure trove online for free. Talk about open-source folklore. He's penned loads of hefty books that might double as doorstops but are chock full of smarts. He mapped out this mythological railway network, not literally railways but myth pathways, which coincidentally aligns almost perfectly with the spread of certain haplogroups. Here's where it gets wild. People tell myths that match their haplogroup. It's not like your genes force you to become a storyteller at campfires. It's more about how these storytelling circles traveled along with their gene-carrying members. And get this, men were the keepers and tellers of these tales while women were probably off doing something far more productive. In Malta? Yep, that place I mentioned earlier where they found this matching haplogroup, archaeologists dug up some mammoth ivory trinkets that fit right into this mythological narrative we've been chatting about. Whether or not those artifacts were gossiping about myths is still up for debate, but finding them on the men's side of an ancient dwelling is quite telling. So, here's the gist of the myth. In the beginning, there was water everywhere. All sorts of critters were swimming around, feeling a bit down. They started diving to the bottom, using their beaks, paws, and whatever else they had to grab bits of earth. Sometimes, in the extended version of the myth, there are unlucky divers and lucky divers. Anyway, some lucky ones managed to bring up pieces of earth, and voila, land was created. Interestingly, the little figurines are designed so that if you hang them, they point head down, like diving birds, not flying ones. This might be tied to the myth, but honestly, it could just be our imagination. However, the haplogroup matches, and the distribution area is the same. On the map, near Lake Baikal, these modern-day folks have the same haplogroups, and it all extends beautifully into North America. But you won't find this in the South, Africa, or Australia. There are some analogies in India, but they're a bit off. Like, why are the guitarists diving? But in South America, nope. Even in the southern part of North America, like Mexico, it's not really there. So, this is a prime example of how we see these migrations: genetic, cultural, and mythological. We know what they were talking about in their tents over 20,000 years ago. It's pretty cool, in my opinion, that we can reconstruct a myth from 20,000 years ago in such detail. Bereskin, being super cautious, never tried to write the original myth but compiled different versions. Some might say it's unscientific, but hey, it's possible to do such a reconstruction. Moreover, he cautiously shows that some myths actually record migrations not just from Eurasia to North America but the first migrations of Homo sapiens from Africa, which happened 50,000 years ago or even earlier. These migrations can be traced through myths, and the oldest myth is about the origin of death. But that's another story. So, here's the gist of the myth. In the beginning, there was water everywhere. All sorts of critters were swimming around, feeling a bit down. They started diving to the bottom, using their beaks, paws, and whatever else they had to grab bits of earth. Sometimes, in the extended version of the myth, there are unlucky divers and lucky divers. Anyway, some lucky ones managed to bring up pieces of earth, and voila, land was created. Interestingly, the little figurines are designed so that if you hang them, they point head down, like diving birds, not flying ones. This might be tied to the myth, but honestly, it could just be our imagination. However, the haplogroup matches, and the distribution area is the same. On the map, near Lake Baikal, these modern-day folks have the same haplogroups, and it all extends beautifully into North America. But you won't find this in the South, Africa, or Australia. There are some analogies in India, but they're a bit off. Like, why are the guitarists diving? But in South America, nope. Even in the southern part of North America, like Mexico, it's not really there. So, this is a prime example of how we see these migrations: genetic, cultural, and mythological. We know what they were talking about in their tents over 20,000 years ago. It's pretty cool, in my opinion, that we can reconstruct a myth from 20,000 years ago in such detail. Bereskin, being super cautious, never tried to write the original myth but compiled different versions. Some might say it's unscientific, but hey, it's possible to do such a reconstruction. Moreover, he cautiously shows that some myths actually record migrations not just from Eurasia to North America but the first migrations of Homo sapiens from Africa, which happened 50,000 years ago or even earlier. These migrations can be traced through myths, and the oldest myth is about the origin of death. But that's another story. So, about these migration capabilities, it's just amazing in my opinion. Around 28,000 years ago, give or take 1,000 years, there was the Dalny Vestinus site. They found a lot of stuff there, but the most fascinating to me is the Dalny Vestinus 35 bone, a fragment of a human femur. It's just a piece of the shaft, no ends, so not much can be deduced except that it belonged to a very large man. It's one of the biggest among all known Cro-Magnons. Only one other in Barma Grande might be bigger. This guy was huge. The thing is, this bone was found in Dalny Vestinus in the Czech Republic, but isotopic analysis showed that he ate marine food throughout his life. The nearest sea, the Adriatic, is 400 kilometers away as the crow flies, but you couldn't go straight because of the Alps and their glaciers. So he zigzagged his way there. Whether he came from the Adriatic or the Black Sea, he made the journey. In my opinion, this makes him the coolest traveler of all time. He traversed the entire known world of his time. To the south, there was just the sea, and to the north, it was too cold near the glaciers. He traveled from one end of the earth to the other. Sure, the world was smaller for him, but still, he covered as much ground as he could. Despite the glaciers to the west and the Balkans and Caucasus to the east, he managed to survive the journey. It's amazing that no one killed him along the way. Maybe they did in the end, who knows? But he managed to negotiate, find food, and keep going. Isotopic analysis shows he ate marine food, so he must have traveled quickly. The big question is, why did he go there? What was he looking for? Dalny Vestinus was a place where many people passed through. The culture there is known from Austria to almost Lake Baikal. The tools, figurines, and Venus statues found there are similar across this vast area. This shows that people moved a lot across the Eurasian steppe. This guy crossed several ecological zones, showing just how far ideas and people traveled back then. So, he traveled through the coastal zone. Then there were some coastal forests with moose and wild boars, then he climbed some mountains and finally reached the steppe. He somehow managed to adapt to new environments along the way, which were completely unfamiliar to him. Originally, he was a fisherman who had never seen a mammoth in his life, as they simply didn't live by the coast. But he ended up in a place littered with mammoth bones and tusks for kilometers. This guy was an epic traveler. It would be amazing to find his diary. Recently, a friend told me he's been writing a book about this. I've mentioned this in my lectures a few times, and people kept asking me to write about his journey. So, my friend took it upon himself to write it. I don't know what he'll come up with, but at least he started. Soon, we'll know the whole truth. This is a concrete example of a journey. What's remarkable about this compared to previous ones is that in the past, artifacts might have been found in India and passed hand to hand for 1,000 years. But here, we have a specific person. Someone suggested that maybe his bone was traded, but I doubt anyone would bother carrying a femur around to trade it from tribe to tribe. That's just nonsense. So, it seems he made the journey himself. Another example of such migration is the burial of a woman under a unique dolmen at Saint-Germain-la-Rivière. She had a beautiful necklace and an apron made of red deer canines. There were many different decorations, including 69 canines in one burial and 22 in the necklace. These canines are rare, so if 55 males with canines were found, the hunter must have killed around 500 deer to collect them. Plus, these deer lived about 200 kilometers to the south. So, here's the last example from Chauvet Cave, also known as Grotte Chauvet, which is much closer to us in time, only 15,000 years ago. These caves aren't exactly in the center of France, but considering the coastline was much further out back then, it's practically central. And there they found this chief's baton with what is quite obviously a whale tail drawn on it. Yep, you could doubt it for ages, but let's face it, it's most likely a whale tail. Moreover, at nearby sites like Istritz, there are actual whale bones. Not whole healthy ones, but all sorts of spear tips made from whale bones, even though the sea is more than 100 kilometers away. But then again, whales are such beasts that you can't just carry one over your shoulder in one go. So most likely these were tribes who roamed from the coast all the way into central France. And by shells, I've shown this before, it becomes clear, and by such artifacts too, so for hunters 100 kilometers isn't really a big deal at all. You could just wander around because when we see that humans have settled the entire planet, it's not so surprising anymore. I mean, if one person could walk 100 kilometers or even 300 kilometers during their lifetime without any trouble, then imagine what a population could do over thousands of years. They did it easily and casually. And from some point around the 16th century onwards, our planet was fully inhabited. Then came all these late great geographical discoveries like Madagascar being settled by Malagasy people. But that's another story endlessly worth talking about with its own nuances, like some specific little island someone sailed to on a boat. That part isn't as interesting as how we populated Earth, and now onto our next stage, settling space. So, Gagarin kind of paved the way, right? He said, "Let's go." And off we went, but where exactly are we going? That's still up in the air. Going back to the basics, why did we even go there in the first place? Now, about the moon, we can technically get there, we've done it before, but we don't go because, well, why? Spend a ton of resources just to leave a few footprints and bring back a rock? What's the point? Until we get a real urgent need for some element that's abundant on the moon, like cesium or something, we're not going. And for that, we need cold fusion, which we'll invent eventually. Or maybe when we mess up the planet enough, we'll find out there's plenty of fresh water in asteroids or comets, or all sorts of ores like iron, uranium, titanium, you name it. Then we'll rush there. But the question is, will Earth's resources be enough to get us there even once? Maybe we can haul some stuff back, but there might be plenty of resources out there, and some might be missing. No air to breathe, no energy sources. No oil, coal, or gas. No oxygen, just frozen water. How do you melt it? There's ice floating around in space, but what do you do with it? On Earth, you can melt it, but out there, the sun doesn't shine much. So, where do we go next? Well, there's still plenty to explore on Earth, like underwater. Our planet is 70% ocean, and we're not exactly comfortable there yet. Sure, many people love the ocean, but loving it doesn't mean we can live there. Maybe in the future, we will. Once we mess up the oceans, we'll head to Mars, Titan, or wherever. But that's for later. So, love to travel? Travel as much as you can. There aren't many unexplored places left on Earth, but you can always rediscover them. If Neanderthals could rediscover the Middle East 10 times, why can't you? So, go to different places, learn a lot of interesting things. Thanks for your attention.